The document weighed almost nothing, a single sheet of county paper, edges crisp, ink still sharp from the clerk's pen. Yet Lenora Hartwell held it as though it might burn through her fingers and drop straight into the dry well at her feet. 32 feet of emptiness. That was what the well represented now. 32 feet of broken promises and limestone walls that had never given up a single drop of water. Her husband Jacob had dug it himself, convinced that persistence and sweat could find what wasn't there. He had been wrong about the water. He had been wrong about a lot of things, as it turned out. But Lenora had loved him anyway, loved him still, even now that he existed only in the ache behind her ribs, in the small hands of the daughter playing nearby. Maggie was 6 years old. She sat in a patch of October sunlight, her rag doll propped against her knees, speaking to it in the serious tones of a mother explaining the world. Beside her, Copper lay with his muzzle on his paws, ears twitching at every shift in the wind. The dog was 5 now, his coat the color of old pennies, and he had not left Lenora's side since the day they pulled Jacob's body from the collapsed mine shaft. That had been spring, the cruelest season as it turned out. The earth thawing just enough to become treacherous, the timbers rotting in places no one could see. Jacob had gone down for a regular shift and never come back up. 15 feet from the exit. That was what the foreman told her. Jacob had been 15 feet from daylight when the ceiling came down, close enough to see the sun, close enough to almost touch his way out, but almost didn't count in the mines, almost just meant they had somewhere to start digging for the body. Now Lenora stood at the edge of a different kind of hole, reading words that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. Notice of intent to reclaim. The man who had written those words stood 10 yards away, watching her with the patient satisfaction of a cat outside a mouse hole. Silas Crenshaw was 58 years old, his hair silver and swept back from a face that had learned long ago how to smile without warmth. He wore a suit too fine for the Kansas dust, boots polished to a shine that seemed almost offensive against the cracked gray earth of her claim. He had brought witnesses. Deputy Virgil Holt sat on horseback behind him, badge catching the light, his expression carefully empty. A younger man Lenora didn't recognize held a leather satchel, probably full of more papers designed to make theft look like law. 60 days. That was the number her eyes kept returning to. 60 days to construct a permanent habitable structure on this land, or the claim would revert to public trust, which meant, of course, that it would end up in Crenshaw's pocket before the ink dried on the auction notice. "I'm being generous, Mrs. Hartwell." Crenshaw's voice carried across the space between them, smooth as snake oil. 60 days is more than most get, considering your circumstances. Lenora didn't look up from the paper. My circumstances. A widow, a child, no family to speak of, and this, he gestured at the claim, the dry well, the small canvas tent that had served as their home since the cabin burned in August. This is no place for a woman alone. Now she looked at him, really looked, the way her father had taught her to look at men who wanted something. Crenshaw met her gaze with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "The law requires a habitable structure," she said. "It does. What defines habitable?" Something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or just impatience. "A permanent dwelling, Mrs. Hartwell. Walls, a roof. Something that demonstrates actual occupation, not—" He waved at the tent again. "Camping. The law says walls and a roof? The law says permanent habitable structure. A tent doesn't qualify. A hole in the ground doesn't qualify." He smiled again, and this time there was an edge to it. "I've seen what you got here. Dirt and disappointment. Take my offer. Sell me the claim. I'll give you enough to start over somewhere sensible." Maggie had stopped talking to her doll. Lenora could feel her daughter's attention, could feel Copper's too, both of them waiting to see what she would do. What she could do, with 60 days and empty pockets and a well that had never given them anything but dry air and broken hopes. "What offer?" Lenora asked. Crenshaw's smile widened. $40, enough for train fare and a room somewhere. Denver, maybe, or back east. A woman like you could find work as a seamstress, a housekeeper. $40 for 160 acres. $40 for 160 acres of nothing, Mrs. Hartwell. No water, no timber worth speaking of. Just dirt, and that, he nodded toward the well, that monument to your husband's optimism. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the claim, making Copper sneeze. Maggie gathered her doll closer, watching the adults with eyes too old for her face. She had learned this past year how to be quiet when quiet was needed, how to take up less space when space was scarce. 6 years old, and already she knew that the world did not bend for little girls without fathers. Lenora folded the notice carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. 60 days. Not a day more. And if I have a permanent habitable structure by then? Crenshaw laughed. The sound was genuine, which somehow made it worse. Mrs. Hartwell, you don't have lumber. You don't have money for lumber. You don't have anyone to help you raise a frame, even if you did. The nearest timber mill is 40 miles away, and they don't extend credit to widows. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though sharing a confidence. I'm not your enemy here. I'm offering you a way out before winter comes, before that child of yours freezes in that tent. He glanced at Maggie as he said it, and something cold moved through Lenora's chest. Not fear, something sharper, something with teeth. You're concerned about my daughter, she said quietly. Someone should be, but not concerned enough to give us fair price for the land. The mask slipped, just for a moment. Lenora saw the real Crenshaw underneath, the calculating machine that wore a human face, that saw people as obstacles or opportunities and nothing in between. Then the smile returned, smooth and practiced. 60 days, Mrs. Hartwell. I'll have the deputy here check on your progress. If you haven't broken ground on something real by November 15th, this conversation is over. He tipped his hat, a parody of courtesy. Ma'am. He turned and walked back to his horse. Deputy Holt lingered a moment longer, his expression unreadable, then followed. Lenora watched them ride toward town, dust rising behind them like a dirty wake. Maggie's voice broke the silence. Mama, are we in trouble? Lenora turned to find her daughter standing now, the rag doll hanging from one hand, Copper pressed against her legs. The dog's eyes were on Lenora, waiting for direction, for reassurance, for some sign that the pack was safe. Come here, little bird. Maggie crossed the distance between them, and Lenora knelt to pull her close. The child smelled like prairie grass and the lavender soap they couldn't really afford, like childhood and survival, mixed together in the particular perfume of the frontier. That man wants to take our land, Lenora said. He thinks we can't build a home in time. Can we? The question hung in the October air, simple and enormous. Lenora looked at the dry well, at the tent, at the endless sky that offered no answers. She thought about lumber she couldn't afford, walls she couldn't raise alone, a deadline that would come regardless of her plans. Your grandfather, she said slowly, used to tell me something when I was your age back in Cornwall. Where the mines are? Yes, little bird, where the mines are. Lenora smoothed a strand of hair from Maggie's face. Grandfather worked in the tin mines, deep in the earth. He used to say that the surface of the world was a frantic, changing thing, that people who lived on top of the ground were always fighting the wind, fighting the cold, fighting the rain. What did he do different? Lenora smiled, and for the first time since Crenshaw's arrival, something like hope moved through her. He went down, 12 feet below the surface, maybe more, and the temperature never changed. Winter or summer, it stayed the same. The earth held its warmth like a mother holds a child. Maggie considered this with the serious attention of a 6-year-old confronting new information. Then she looked at the well. Is that why Papa dug the hole? To be warm? Papa dug the hole for water, but maybe… Lenora paused, the idea taking shape like a photograph developing in a chemical bath. Maybe the hole can be something else, something Mr. Crenshaw never thought of. Like what? Lenora rose, still holding Maggie's hand, and walked to the edge of the well. 32 feet of limestone and clay, carefully shored with fieldstone for the first 8 feet. Jacob had done good work, careful work. The walls were plumb and stable. The stone fitted tight enough that nothing had shifted in 2 years of Kansas weather. She picked up a pebble and dropped it, counted the seconds. 1, 2. The impact was a dry thud, not a splash, the sound of packed earth, dense and solid. The law says I need a habitable structure, Lenora said, more to herself than to Maggie. It doesn't say which direction the structure has to face. I don't understand, Mama. Lenora looked down at her daughter, at Copper's patient face, at the shadows already growing long across the claim. In 60 days, the ground would be frozen. In 60 days, Crenshaw would return with his papers and his smile and his absolute certainty that she had failed. We're going to build a home, Maggie, but we're not going to build up. She pointed at the well. We're going to build down. That night, after Maggie had fallen asleep in the tent with Copper curled against her back, Lenora lit a candle and retrieved her father's journal from the trunk that held everything she valued in the world. The journal was small, leather-bound, the pages soft with handling. Samuel Tregarth had been a drainage engineer for the Cornish tin mines, a man who spoke of gradients and hydrostatic pressure the way other men spoke of weather or cattle prices. He had filled this book with diagrams, calculations, observations recorded in a cramped but precise hand. Lenora turned the pages slowly, letting memory guide her. Here was a sketch of a Roman drainage system her father had adapted. Here was a cross-section of a ventilation shaft with notes about airflow and temperature gradients. Here was the passage she half remembered, the words that had surfaced when she stood at the well's edge. The surface world is subject to every whim of weather and season. But 12 feet below ground, the Earth maintains its mean annual temperature regardless of conditions above. In Cornwall, this is approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The deeper one goes, the more stable this becomes. A chamber 30 feet down is insulated by the mass of the Earth itself, millions of tons of thermal battery, storing the warmth of summer against the cold of winter. Lenora read the passage 3 times, then turned to a fresh page in her own notebook and began to write. The well was 32 feet deep. The bottom had been widened slightly by Jacob's efforts to find water, but it was still essentially a cylinder, 4 feet across, too narrow for living. But the walls were stone-lined for the first 8 feet. That was where seepage was most likely, and Jacob had been thorough. Below that, the walls were raw earth, clay and compressed silt that had held their shape for 2 years without support. If the earth was stable enough to stand on its own, it might be stable enough to carve. She sketched through the night, her candle burning low, Copper's soft snoring the only sound besides the scratch of her pencil. The idea was simple, really. Elegantly simple, the way her father's best designs had always been. Don't fight the earth. Don't try to build on top of it like everyone else. Go into it. Let it wrap around you like a blanket. By dawn, she had a plan. By the second day, she had found the old tripod hoist Jacob had abandoned in the shed. By the third day, she was lowering herself into the well with a short-handled pick and a bucket tied to her waist. The physical reality of the work was something she could not have fully imagined from above. The well shaft swallowed light. 10 feet down, the October sunshine became a pale circle overhead, beautiful and remote, like looking up at the moon from the bottom of a grave. The walls pressed in, not threatening but present, a constant reminder that she was somewhere humans were not meant to be. The first day she simply explored, ran her hands along the limestone and clay, felt for weak spots, listened to the way sound moved in the confined space. The air was cool and still, carrying a mineral smell that reminded her of her father's clothes after a shift underground. Not unpleasant, just different. The smell of earth that had never known sunlight. The temperature was exactly what she had hoped. 50 degrees, give or take. In another month, the surface would be freezing. Here, 30 feet down, it would still be 50 degrees. In January, when the blizzards came, it would still be 50 degrees. The earth kept its own schedule, followed its own rules, and those rules did not include dying of cold. She began to dig on the 4th day. The process was granular and back-breaking. Strike the clay with the pick, fill the bucket, climb the rope ladder, haul the bucket up with the tripod hoist, dump the spoil, descend again. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Maggie helped as much as a 6-year-old could. She counted buckets, a game that taught her numbers while keeping her occupied. She brought water and cornbread down the first few rungs of the ladder when Lenora paused to rest. She talked to Copper about what Mama was doing, explaining in her serious little voice that they were building a house that went down instead of up. And wasn't that clever? And wouldn't Papa be proud? The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening. He stationed himself at the rim of the well during the day, watching Lenora descend and ascend, occasionally whining when she was out of sight for too long. At night, he slept between Maggie and the tent flap, guarding them both against whatever might come. By the end of the first week, Lenora had expanded the bottom of the well from 4 feet across to 6. Not much, not nearly enough. But her hands were adapting to the work, her shoulders learning the rhythm, her body remembering what it meant to labor without rest. She thought about Jacob constantly, not with grief. That would come later when she had time for it, but with a kind of ongoing conversation. He had known the mines, had spent years underground before coming to Kansas. She found herself asking him questions in her mind, hearing his voice suggest answers. The clay here is good, Jacob. Dense, holds its shape. Watch for seams, Nora. Places where different layers meet. That's where it likes to crumble. I'm being careful. You're always careful. That's why I married you. It wasn't grief. It was companionship. The only kind left to her. The skeptics began arriving in the second week. Thaddeus Mercer came first. He owned the general store in town, a man of 47 who had lived in Broken Ridge for a quarter century and considered that tenure a source of unquestionable authority. He drove his wagon out on a Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to deliver supplies Lenora hadn't ordered, actually to see for himself what the crazy widow was doing. He found her emerging from the well, clay coating her arms to the elbows, sweat cutting channels through the dust on her face. Maggie was sitting nearby with her doll, counting buckets. The mound of excavated earth had grown substantial enough to cast its own shadow. Mercer didn't bother with pleasantries. "What in God's name are you doing?" Lenora lowered her bucket and began untying her rope. "Building a home, Mr. Mercer." "In a hole?" "In the earth." He dismounted from his wagon and walked closer, peering down into the well with the expression of a man watching someone drown and refusing to throw a rope. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've lived here 25 years. I've seen droughts and floods and everything in between. And I'm telling you, the first good rain will turn that hole into a soup pot. You and your little girl will drown in your own cellar." Lenora pulled on her gloves and picked up her water canteen. "The rain hasn't come for 3 years, Mr. Mercer. I'll take my chances with water if it means escaping the wind." "It's not just the water, it's the air." He shook his head, warming to his lecture. "Underground air is foul. Bad vapors. Everyone knows this. You'll poison that child-breathing cave air. My father worked 40 years in the Cornish tin mines. He breathed underground air every day of his working life. And where is your father now?" "Dead at 71. Of old age. In his sleep." Mercer had no answer for that. He looked at the well, at the mound of clay, at Maggie watching them both with her knowing eyes. Then he shook his head again and climbed back onto his wagon. "You're going to die down there, Mrs. Hartwell. You and that little girl. And when they pull your bodies out, everyone will say I tried to warn you." He drove away without looking back. Lenora watched him go, then turned to Maggie. "What did you count up to?" 47 buckets. "Good girl. Let's see if we can reach 60 before supper. Now I want you to pause for a moment. Just pause. Imagine yourself in Lenora's position. 60 days. No money. No help. A 6-year-old daughter depending on you. And a hole in the ground that everyone says will kill you both. What would you do? Would you keep digging? Would you trust the words of a dead father over the warnings of living neighbors? Think about that. Then let's continue. The second skeptic arrived 3 days after Mercer. Dr. Edmund Ashworth was 42, educated in Philadelphia, and possessed the particular confidence of a man who believed science had rendered all ancestral knowledge obsolete. He came with his black medical bag and his grave professional expression, explaining that several concerned citizens had asked him to evaluate Mrs. Hartwell's mental state. Lenora received him at the rim of the well, her hands raw from the pick, her dress stiff with dried clay. Maggie sat nearby, practicing letters in the dirt with a stick while Copper watched. "I understand you've been experiencing considerable stress," Dr. Ashworth began. "The loss of your husband, the financial difficulties. These things can affect a woman's judgment." "My judgment is fine, Doctor. Mrs. Hartwell, you are digging a hole in the ground and apparently intending to live in it. With a child." He peered down into the shaft. "Underground air is full of carbonic gases. Miasmas. Science has proven this. The deeper you go, the more poisonous it becomes. Science has proven that. Modern science, yes. Lenora wiped her hands on her apron. My father was an engineer. He studied the air and mines his entire career. He found that properly ventilated underground spaces have cleaner air than most surface dwellings. No dust, no pollen, consistent humidity. Your father was not a trained physician? No, he was a man who believed in measurement over assumption, doctor, which is, I believe, also supposed to be the foundation of modern science. Dr. Ashworth's expression tightened. I'm trying to help you. Then help me haul buckets. He didn't. He left the same way Mercer had, shaking his head, already composing the story he would tell at the saloon. The widow had gone mad. Grief and desperation had broken her mind. It was only a matter of time before someone found her and the child dead at the bottom of that well. Martha Grimes spread that story faster than wildfire. She was a widow herself, 53 years old, and she had made gossip into something approaching an art form. Within 2 days of Dr. Ashworth's visit, every person in Broken Ridge had heard that Lenora Hartwell was burying her child alive, that she had lost her mind from grief, that someone really ought to contact the authorities before something terrible happened. The story reached Lenora through old Sven Lindqvist, the Swedish blacksmith who made the journey to her claim on a quiet Thursday afternoon. They're saying you've gone mad, he told her, his accent still thick after 30 years in America. Martha Grimes is telling everyone you're digging a grave for your daughter. Lenora set down her pick and climbed the ladder. Her shoulders ached. Her hands were blistered beneath the calluses. But she had expanded the chamber to 8 feet across now, and the walls were holding. And what do you think, Mr. Lindqvist? The old blacksmith said nothing at first, just stood at the rim of the well, looking down at the work she had done. Then he descended the ladder without asking permission. Lenora watched him examine the walls, running his thick fingers over the stone she had laid, studying the curve of the ceiling she was beginning to form. When he emerged, there were tears in his eyes. Jordkellara, he said quietly. Earth cellar. My grandmother had one in Uppsala. My grandfather built it the year they married. They raised 7 children in that house, and every winter, when the cold came, the children slept in the earth cellar. Not one of them ever got sick. This isn't just a cellar, Lenora said. This is going to be a home. Sven nodded slowly. Yeah, I see this. The shape is right. The stone is right. He looked at her with new respect. You know the old ways. My father knew them. He taught me. Cornwall? Cornwall? The old blacksmith smiled, and it transformed his face. The old countries remember what the new country forgets. You keep working, Mrs. Hartwell? Don't let them stop you. He came back the next day with a gift, a set of chisels he had forged himself, sized for detail work in stone. He came back the day after that with advice about drainage, showing her where to cut channels in the soft shale to direct any seepage away from her living space. He never helped with the actual labor. His hands were too arthritic for that, his body too worn by decades at the forge. But he watched. He advised. He bore witness. And when people in town asked him about the crazy widow and her hole in the ground, Sven Lindqvist told them they were fools who had forgotten everything worth remembering. The sabotage happened on the 18th night. Lenora had been dreaming about Jacob, one of the good dreams, where he was alive and laughing, swinging Maggie up onto his shoulders, calling Lenora his Cornish queen, the way he used to do when he was feeling romantic. She woke from the dream to Copper's frantic barking. The dog stood at the tent flap, hackles raised, growling at something outside. Maggie stirred beside Lenora, whimpering at the noise. In the darkness, Lenora could hear footsteps retreating, running. She grabbed the rifle, Jacob's rifle, which she had never fired but always kept loaded, and pushed out of the tent. No one was visible in the moonlight, just dust settling from rapid movement and Copper straining against some invisible leash of loyalty. The damage was at the well. Someone had cut the main rope of the tripod hoist, cut it with a knife, leaving frayed ends that would have given way the moment weight was applied. If Lenora had descended in the morning without checking, the way she usually did, she would have been halfway down when the rope parted, 32 feet onto packed earth. Not enough to kill necessarily, but enough to break bones, enough to end the work. She stood there in the darkness, looking at the sabotage, thinking about who might have done it. Crenshaw was the obvious answer. Or someone paid by Crenshaw. Jedediah Tanner, maybe. The young man she had seen smirking at her in town, making bets about when she would give up. Maggie appeared at her elbow, copper pressed against the child's legs. "Mama, what happened?" "Someone doesn't want us to build our home." "Why?" Lenora knelt and pulled her daughter close. "How did you explain malice to a 6-year-old? How did you describe a world where some people would rather see you fail than succeed at something they didn't understand?" "Some people are afraid of things that are different," she said finally. "They want everyone to do things the way they've always been done. And when someone tries something new, it scares them." "Is Mr. Crenshaw scared of us?" "Maybe. Or maybe he just wants our land and doesn't care how he gets it." Maggie considered this with her usual gravity. Then she looked at the cut rope and back at her mother. "What are we going to do?" Lenora thought about quitting. Just for a moment, she let herself imagine it. Taking Crenshaw's $40, getting on a train, finding some dim room in some distant city where she could sew hems and scrub floors and slowly forget that she had ever been anything but tired. Then she looked at Maggie, at Copper, at the well that held everything she had left to give. "We're going to fix the rope," she said, "and then we're going to add a second one so this can't happen again. And then we're going to keep building." Reverend Ezekiel Moss came to her on a Sunday night, 2 weeks before the deadline. He was 72 years old, the minister of the small clapboard church in town, a man whose sermons rarely lasted more than 15 minutes because he believed God preferred brevity. He walked the 2 miles from Broken Ridge to Lenora's claim, arriving just after sunset, his coat dusty and his breathing labored. Lenora offered him water. He accepted, drinking deeply before speaking. "I knew your husband, Mrs. Hartwell. Everyone knew Jacob. He came to see me before he died. Did you know that?" Lenora shook her head. Jacob had never been religious. He used to say the mines had taught him that God, if he existed, was far more interested in geology than theology. "He told me something," the Reverend continued, "about this land, about what he'd found when he was digging that well. He found nothing, just dry earth. He found signs, Mrs. Hartwell. At 50 feet, he found signs of water, a seam of wet clay, the smell of moisture. He was planning to keep digging, to go deeper, but then—" The old man trailed off, spreading his hands. "The mine. The mine." Lenora sat down heavily on the trunk outside her tent. The well was 40 feet away, the tripod silhouette black against the stars. She had been so focused on the immediate problem, shelter, survival, the deadline, that she hadn't thought about water, hadn't thought about what else the earth might hold. "Why are you telling me this?" Reverend Moss leaned forward, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Because Silas Crenshaw knows. Jacob told him too, trying to raise money for better drilling equipment. And I believe Mr. Crenshaw has been waiting for your husband's claim ever since. For the water. Whoever controls the water in Broken Ridge controls the whole valley, Mrs. Hartwell. Every farm, every ranch, every business depends on it. Right now, people rely on the creek, but the creek is drying up. Has been for years." He looked at her with something like sorrow in his weathered face. "Crenshaw isn't trying to take worthless land from a helpless widow. He's trying to steal the future of this valley before anyone realizes what it's worth." Lenora absorbed this slowly. The information changed nothing about her immediate situation. She still needed shelter, still had a deadline, still had to survive the winter. But it added a layer she hadn't seen before. A reason behind the pressure, the sabotage, the smug certainty in Crenshaw's smile. He wasn't just greedy, he was strategic, and she was standing between him and everything he wanted. "Thank you for telling me, Reverend. Mrs. Hartwell, Lenora, be careful. Men like Crenshaw don't lose gracefully." "I don't intend to let him lose at all." She stood, straightening her spine. "I intend to make him irrelevant." The ventilation system took shape in the 5th week. Lenora had found the materials in the abandoned mining camp 3 miles north. 2 lengths of corrugated iron pipe, each about 6 inches in diameter, crushed at the ends but otherwise sound. She had dragged them back to her claim over 2 days, hauling them through the prairie grass like a woman pulling the bones of some great metal beast. Jedediah Tanner saw her on the second day. He was riding with two other young men from town, all of them wearing the knowing smirks of people who had already decided she was a joke. "You planning on breathing through a straw, Mrs. Hartwell?" Jed called out. "There ain't no gold down there. Ain't no water neither, from what I hear." Lenora didn't stop walking, didn't look at him, just kept dragging the pipe through the grass, her shoulders burning, her hands already raw from the corrugated edges. "She's not gonna make it," one of the other young men said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Crenshaw says she'll be begging to sell by first frost. I got $5, says she gives up before then." "You're on." They rode away laughing. Lenora let their voices fade into the distance, then stopped to catch her breath. The pipe was heavier than it looked. Everything was heavier than it looked on the frontier. The work, the loneliness, the weight of proving everyone wrong. But she kept walking. The pipes went into the ground on the 38th day. One became the intake, buried in a trench 6 feet deep, running 30 feet from the well opening to a screen vent on the surface. Air would enter through the vent, travel through the buried pipe, and be warmed by the constant temperature of the earth before reaching the chamber. By the time it arrived, it would be comfortable regardless of whether the surface was baking or frozen. The other pipe became the exhaust, positioned at the top of the chamber and angling up through the earth to emerge near the well opening. The angle was critical. Lenora had calculated it from her father's notes on mine ventilation. When wind blew across the top of the exhaust, it would create a low-pressure zone, pulling stale air out of the chamber. The faster the wind, the stronger the draft. It was a passive system. No fans, no fuel, nothing that could break or run out. Just physics and geometry, working together the way they had worked for thousands of years before anyone thought to call it science. Maggie watched her mother bury the pipes with the solemn attention of an apprentice witnessing sacred work. "What are those for, Mama?" "Breathing, little bird. Our house needs to breathe just like we do. How come other houses don't have pipes in the ground?" Lenora paused, leaning on her shovel. "Other houses breathe through their cracks, through the spaces where the walls don't fit tight. But those cracks let in the cold too. Our house won't have cracks, so we give it lungs instead." Maggie considered this. "Copper breathes. Does copper have lungs?" "Copper has lungs inside his chest. So our house will have lungs inside the ground?" "Exactly right." The child nodded, satisfied with this logic, and went back to counting the spadefuls of dirt her mother moved. 47, 48, 49. Copper sat beside her, watching the work with patient eyes, occasionally thumping his tail against the ground, when Lenora looked up and smiled at them both. "I want you to stop here for a moment. Think about what Lenora is building. Not just a shelter, a system, a way of living that uses the earth itself as protection. No one taught her this in any school. No one gave her permission. She took the knowledge her father left her and made it into something new. Do you believe she can finish in time? Do you believe the earth will hold? Think about that as we continue." Deputy Virgil Holt came on the 43rd day. He didn't bring Crenshaw this time. Didn't bring anyone. Just rode out alone, dismounted at the edge of the claim, and walked toward the well with his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. Lenora was just emerging from the shaft when she saw him. Her dress was caked with clay. Her hair had escaped its braid and hung in damp strings around her face. She looked, she knew, like something that had crawled out of the earth, which was, in a sense, exactly what she was. "Mrs. Hartwell." "Deputy." He stood at the rim looking down. The chamber was nearly complete now, a vaulted room 15 feet below the original bottom of the well, plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and lime. The walls glowed pale in the light of the candle she had left burning below. It looked, even to her exhausted eyes, like something approaching habitable. "Mr. Crenshaw sent me to check your progress." "I'm sure he did." Holt said nothing for a long moment, just stood there looking. Then he crouched and picked up a handful of the excavated earth, letting it run through his fingers. "This is good clay," he said quietly. "Dense, stable." Lenora waited. "My grandfather was a miner," Holt continued, not looking at her. "Back in Pennsylvania. Coal. He used to tell me about the old tunnels, how some of them had been there for 100 years without a beam to hold them up. Said the earth knew how to carry itself, if you cut it right. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man. He was. Holt stood, brushing the clay from his hands. Crenshaw expects me to report that you failed, that this is just, he gestured at the well, a hole. And what are you going to report? The deputy met her eyes for the first time. Something complicated moved behind his expression. Duty, doubt, the particular shame of a man realizing he has been serving the wrong master. I'm going to report what I see, he said, which is a structure, underground but a structure nonetheless, with walls and a ceiling and… He looked at the ventilation pipes. Whatever those are. Lungs, Maggie supplied from nearby. Our house has lungs. Holt almost smiled. Lungs. Sure. He turned back to his horse, then paused. Mrs. Hartwell, the first real cold snap is coming. Week or two, according to the old-timers. After that comes whatever comes. If that chamber of yours works the way you think it does, it will. Then I hope you're right, for your sake and your daughter's. He rode away without looking back. Lenora watched him go, then turned to find Maggie and Copper both watching her. Is he a good man, Mama? I think he might be trying to be, little bird, which is sometimes the best we can hope for. The plastering took 4 days. Lenora mixed the clay with straw and a small amount of lime. The lime had cost her wedding ring, traded to a farmer 10 miles south, who asked no questions about why a widow might need building materials. The mixture went on wet and heavy, smoothed with a flat board until the walls gleamed pale and uniform. The purpose wasn't beauty, it was survival. A drafty underground room would become a damp tomb, moisture seeping through the stone and clay, breeding mold and decay. But a sealed room, airtight, waterproof, would stay dry as bone. She cut drainage channels into the soft shale below the floor level, lining them with charcoal to filter any water that might find its way in. She built a raised platform for sleeping, 3 inches off the ground, so even in the worst case, they wouldn't wake up in a puddle. She fashioned a heavy hatch for the well opening, using 2 layers of salvaged iron with prairie grass packed between them for insulation. On the wall beside the sleeping platform, she carved 2 names into the stone with one of Sven's chisels. Jacob Hartwell. And below it, the earth keeps its promises. When she closed the hatch for the first time, standing in the chamber with Maggie and Copper, the silence was extraordinary. No wind, no creak of canvas, no whisper of grass or distant coyote call. Just the absolute stillness of the earth, wrapping around them like arms. Mama? Maggie's voice was hushed. I can hear my heart. I know, little bird. I can hear mine too. They stood there for a long moment, the 3 of them, listening to themselves breathe in the quiet dark. Copper's tail began to wag, slowly at first, then faster. He turned in a circle and lay down on the packed clay floor with a contented groan. I think Copper likes it, Maggie said. I think Copper is smarter than most people. Silas Crenshaw returned on the 58th day. He brought Deputy Holt and the young clerk with the leather satchel. He brought papers and authority and the cold certainty of a man who has already won. The November wind cut across the prairie, carrying the promise of winter, as he dismounted and walked toward the well. Lenora was waiting for him. She stood beside the excavation, her dress clean for the first time in weeks, her hair properly braided, her chin raised. Maggie held Copper's collar nearby. The dog was growling, low and continuous, sensing something in the air that humans couldn't name. Mrs. Hartwell. Crenshaw's smile was thin. Time's up. Where is the habitable structure? All I see is a pile of dirt and some pipes sticking out of the ground. Lenora said nothing. She walked to the hatch, unbolted the heavy iron latch, and swung it open. A plume of warm air rose from the opening, visible in the cold November morning, carrying the scent of clay and lime and the small fire she had lit below. Crenshaw's smile faltered. It is 32 feet deep, Lenora said, her voice steady. The walls are braced with stone and sealed with lime. It is ventilated by passive air exchange, the same principle used in mines throughout Europe. The internal temperature has remained at 50 degrees for the past 2 weeks, regardless of surface conditions. She stepped aside and gestured toward the ladder visible below. Mr. Crenshaw, would you like to come down and check the square footage? For a long moment, no one moved. The wind howled across the prairie, flattening the dead grass, sending dust devils spinning across the empty land. Crenshaw stared at the warm air, rising from the earth like breath from the mouth of some sleeping beast. Then Holt moved forward. "I'll go." He descended the ladder slowly, hand over hand, his boots echoing against the rungs. Lenora watched his head disappear below the rim, then his shoulders, then his boots. From above, she could see the candlelight playing across the whitewashed walls, the shadow of the deputy moving through her carefully constructed home. He was down there for 3 minutes, maybe 4. Long enough for Crenshaw's expression to curdle from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear. When Holt emerged, there was something different in his face, something like wonder. "It's a house," he said quietly. "It's got walls, it's got a ceiling. It's got air that's cleaner than anything on the surface. And it's warm down there. Genuinely warm." He looked at Crenshaw, and for the first time, there was no deference in his eyes. "The deed stands." Crenshaw's face went red. He stepped toward the well, peering down with barely contained fury. "This is a trick. A cellar. You can't live like a badger and call it a home." Lenora didn't blink. "The law says habitable structure, Mr. Crenshaw. It doesn't say which direction it has to face. This home won't burn in a fire, won't blow away in a cyclone, won't freeze in a blizzard." She paused, letting the wind underscore her words. "Can you say the same about your office?" Crenshaw stared at her for a long moment. The clerk shuffled nervously. Holt said nothing, but there was something like respect in his silence. "You'll regret this," Crenshaw said finally. "When the real winter comes, when the real cold hits, that hole will be your grave." He turned and mounted his horse, kicking it into motion without another word. The clerk scrambled after him. Holt lingered a moment longer. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "whatever comes next, I hope you're ready." Then he too was gone, and Lenora was alone with Maggie and Copper, and the warm breath rising from the earth. "Mama?" Maggie's voice was small. "Did we win?" Lenora knelt and gathered her daughter close. "We won this battle, little bird, but I don't think the war's over yet." Above them, the sky was turning the color of bruised fruit. The old-timers had been talking for days about the signs, the birds vanishing, the cattle huddling, the way the air pressure had been dropping like a stone falling into a well. Something was coming. The storm announced itself with silence. December 18th, 1882. The morning began like any other. Gray sky, cold wind, the smell of snow in the air. Lenora woke in the chamber with Maggie curled against her, and Copper warming their feet, the familiar earthen ceiling close above her head. But something was different. The birds were gone. Every sparrow, every crow, every prairie hen that normally scratched through the dead grass had vanished overnight. The silence they left behind was profound, unsettling, an emptiness where sound should be. Lenora climbed the ladder and pushed open the hatch. The wind hit her immediately, sharp and searching, colder than it had any right to be in early morning. She looked toward town and saw nothing but flat gray land under a flat gray sky. But to the north, where the horizon should have been clear, a wall of purple-black was building. Not clouds exactly. Something denser, something alive with its own terrible purpose. She had seen storms before. Kansas didn't lack for weather. But this was different. The color was wrong. The pressure was wrong. Even the way the wind moved was wrong. Not gusting, but building. Steady and relentless, like a giant drawing breath. Old Sven Lindqvist had described this once, during one of his visits. He called it Dödens färg, the color of death. In Sweden, his grandmother had said, such skies came once in a generation. People who went out in them didn't come back. Lenora descended the ladder and began to prepare. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. At 9 in the morning, it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold but manageable. By noon, it was below zero and falling. The wind had risen to 40 miles an hour, then 50, carrying a fine crystalline snow that didn't fall so much as fly, horizontal, screaming, a billion tiny knives cutting through any crack or gap. Lenora pulled the hatch shut and dropped the iron bolt. The sound of the latch engaging was oddly final, like the closing of a door that might not open again. She turned to find Maggie watching her with wide eyes and Copper pressed against the child's legs. "We're staying inside now, aren't we, Mama?" "Yes, little bird. For a while." "How long?" Lenora didn't know. No one knew. The storm could last hours or days or longer. She had laid in supplies, dried meat and cornmeal, and a barrel of water she had hauled down bucket by bucket. Enough for a week, maybe two if they were careful. Beyond that, she chose not to think about. "Let's read a story," she said instead. "Which book do you want?" Above ground, the world was ending. The wind reached 65 miles per hour by nightfall, carrying snow that piled into drifts 10 feet high within hours. Visibility dropped to zero. People who ventured outside to check on livestock became disoriented within steps of their doors. Some found their way back, some didn't. In town, the thin-walled frame buildings began to fail. Wood that had seemed solid in summer turned brittle in the killing cold, cracking and splitting as the temperature plummeted. Chimneys clogged with driven snow. Fires went out. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, watching their breath freeze in the air, listening to the storm tear at their walls. Thaddeus Mercer's General Store, the largest building in Broken Ridge, had become a makeshift shelter for 3 families whose roofs had already collapsed. But even the store was failing. The temperature inside had dropped to 15 degrees. Ice was forming on the interior walls. The breath of the huddled children hung in the air like ghost fog. At 9 o'clock on the second night, Mercer gathered the men who could still move and made a decision. "The Hartwell place," he said, his voice cracking from the cold. "That underground room of hers." "That hole in the ground?" someone asked. "You said it would kill her." "I said a lot of things." Mercer pulled on every piece of clothing he owned. "Right now I'm thinking maybe I was wrong. They came like ghosts through the white darkness. 6 of them at first, roped together, moving by compass and hope through a landscape that had been erased. The snow was up to their waists in places, deeper in the drifts. The wind pushed against them like a living thing, determined to knock them down, turn them around, send them wandering in circles until they froze. Mercer led the way because it had been his idea and his shame. Behind him came Dr. Ashworth, who had told Lenora that underground air would poison her child. Behind him came Jedediah Tanner, who had bet $5 she would fail. Behind them came others, men and women who had laughed, who had doubted, who had turned away. They found the well by the ventilation pipes, those 2 iron ears sticking up out of the snow that Tanner had mocked. The pipes were rimmed with frost, but still breathing. Warm air rising from below, visible as steam in the frozen night. Mercer fell to his knees beside the hatch and began to pound. In the chamber below, Copper heard them first. His ears came up, swiveling toward the ceiling. Then he began to bark, not his usual alarm bark, but something more urgent. Lenora was on her feet immediately, heart racing, thinking of collapse, of flood, of all the ways the earth might have betrayed her. But it wasn't the earth. It was hammering, fists against iron, muffled voices, barely audible through the storm in the soil. "Someone's up there," Maggie whispered. Lenora climbed the ladder and pressed her ear against the hatch. The pounding continued, desperate now, arrhythmic. Through the thick iron and the packed grass insulation, she could hear something that might have been her name. She threw back the bolt. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow drove into her face, blinding her. But she could see shapes in the white madness. Human shapes, hunched and struggling, reaching toward the warm air that rose from the hole in the ground. Thaddeus Mercer's face emerged from the chaos. He was barely recognizable. His beard was a solid mask of ice. His eyes were crusted with frozen tears. His lips moved, but whatever he was trying to say was lost in the howl of the storm. Lenora grabbed him by the collar and hauled him toward the opening. "Get down the ladder," she shouted into his ear. "One at a time. Don't stop to pray and don't stop to talk." One by one they came. Mercer first, then Dr. Ashworth, then Jed Tanner with his frozen hands and his terrified eyes. Then others, Mrs. Mercer and her 3 children, the doctor's wife, Martha Grimes, clutching her shawl and weeping. 2 farmhands who had been caught on the road when the storm hit. 14 people in all, tumbling down the ladder into the warm darkness below. Lenora was last. She pulled the hatch shut against the screaming wind, drove the bolt home, and descended into silence. The transition was a shock beyond words. From 40 below zero to 50 above. From wind that could strip flesh to air that didn't move at all. The survivors collapsed on the packed clay floor, their frozen clothes beginning to steam, their bodies convulsing as blood returned to extremities that had been dying. Jedediah Tanner was weeping, not from sorrow but from pain, the particular agony of thawing flesh, of nerves waking up and screaming. His fingers were white with frostbite. He would lose 2 of them, though he didn't know that yet. Dr. Ashworth sat against the wall, his eyes closed, his chest heaving. His wife clung to him, shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with cold. Martha Grimes huddled in a corner, her face in her hands, her body shaking with something that might have been relief or might have been shame. Thaddeus Mercer lay on his back, staring up at the curved ceiling, at the candlelight playing across the smooth white surface. His breath came in ragged gasps, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a croak. "How is it warm in here? You don't have a stove. You don't have a hearth. The world is dying up there, and you're sitting in a summer afternoon." Lenora poured water from the pitcher that sat beside her bedroll. Unfrozen water. Room temperature water in a world where everything liquid had turned to ice. "It isn't hot, Mr. Mercer. It's just the Earth's memory of September." She handed him the cup. "You spent your life building boxes to catch the wind, and then you act surprised when the wind takes what you give it. I didn't build a house. I reclaimed a constant." Maggie was already moving among the survivors, bringing blankets to the shivering children, murmuring comfort in her small, serious voice. Copper had stationed himself near the Mercer children, letting them bury their hands in his fur, providing warmth and comfort that required no explanation. "Mama says sharing makes everyone warm," Maggie told the youngest Mercer girl, who was 7 and had not spoken since they came down the ladder. "We have enough blankets. We have enough everything." The little girl, Emma, her name was Emma, looked up at Maggie with eyes that had seen too much in the past 2 days. Then slowly, she reached out and took the blanket being offered. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken in hours. "I want you to stop here. 14 people now in a chamber built for 3. The same people who called her crazy, who bet against her, who spread rumors that she was burying her child alive. And she let them in, every single one. She didn't ask if they had mocked her, didn't ask if they had sabotaged her ropes. She just opened the door. I want you to think about that. Would you have done the same? Could you have done the same? Think about it. Then let's continue. On the 5th day, there was another knock. By then, the survivors had settled into a rhythm. They slept in shifts on the raised platform Lenora had built. They rationed the food she had stored. They talked in hushed voices about the storm that still raged above them, about the world that might or might not exist when it finally stopped. But the knock changed everything. It was weaker than the first one, barely audible, just a faint tap, tap, tap against the iron hatch, as though whatever was making it had almost no strength left to give. Lenora climbed the ladder. She pressed her ear to the cold metal. For a moment she heard nothing but the eternal wind. Then faintly, a voice, a man's voice, cracked and broken, saying something she couldn't quite make out. She looked down at the faces below. Mercer, Ashworth, Tanner, all of them watching her, knowing what that knock meant, knowing who might be out there. It could be anyone, Ashworth said quietly. It could be Crenshaw, Tanner said, come to take the land while we're all underground. Lenora thought about that. Thought about the man who had tried to steal her home, who had probably ordered the sabotage of her ropes, who had smiled his cold smile and promised her she would regret defying him. Then she thought about Maggie, about what her daughter was watching, about what kind of lesson she wanted to teach in this moment, in this place, with death howling overhead. She looked at her daughter. Maggie's eyes were wide, waiting. "Mama," the child said softly, "he's cold." Lenora threw back the bolt. Silas Crenshaw tumbled through the opening like a man falling into his own grave. He was barely conscious, his fine suit reduced to frozen rags, his silver hair matted with ice and blood where he had struck his head on something in the dark. Behind him, the storm continued its assault, snow driving through the opening, wind screaming its fury at this warm defiance. Lenora grabbed him under the arms and hauled him toward the ladder. Help me, she said to whoever was listening. For a moment, no one moved. They had all suffered because of this man. They all had reasons to let the cold take him. Then Mercer rose from his place against the wall and moved to help. Get his leg, he said. Easy. The ladder's narrow. Together they maneuvered Crenshaw's frozen body down into the chamber. Together they stripped off his ice-crusted clothes and wrapped him in blankets. Together they worked his limbs to restore circulation, fed him small sips of water, kept him from slipping into the final sleep that the cold invited. He would live. It would take days for the feeling to return to his feet, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But he would live, because Lenora Hartwell had opened the door. The storm lasted 7 days. 7 days of screaming wind and killing cold, and a world made of nothing but white. 7 days of 17 people in a hole in the ground, sharing food and blankets in the air that circulated through pipes they had once mocked. 7 days of learning each other's names and stories and fears. Emma Mercer, the 7-year-old who had been silent for so long, gradually began to speak again. Her first full sentence, delivered to Copper with great solemnity, was, "You are a very good dog, and I love you." Copper thumped his tail against the clay floor and licked her face, and for the first time in days, someone in the chamber laughed. Dr. Ashworth spent hours in conversation with Lenora, learning about the ventilation system, the drainage channels, the principles of thermal mass that her father had taught her. By the third day, he was making sketches, asking questions, apologizing for his earlier certainty with the awkward grace of a man encountering humility for the first time. Martha Grimes, who had spread the cruelest rumors, sat in her corner for the first 3 days without speaking to anyone. On the 4th day, she approached Lenora while the others slept. "I told everyone you were mad," she whispered, her eyes swollen with tears and shame. "I said terrible things. I said you were burying your child alive, and you still opened the door for me." Lenora handed her a cup of water. "The door was never about who deserved to come in, Mrs. Grimes. It was about who needed to. How can you forgive me? Forgiveness comes later. Right now we survive. Everything else can wait." Jedediah Tanner lost 2 fingers to frostbite, as Lenora had suspected he would. On the morning the reality set in, when Ashworth told him the blackened flesh would have to come off, he didn't cry. He just looked at Lenora with something like wonder. "I cut your rope," he said, "the night before the inspection. Crenshaw paid me to do it." Lenora said nothing. "You could have died or broken your back, and you still let me in." "Yes. Why?" She thought about the question for a long moment. "My husband used to say that the mines taught him everything worth knowing about people, that when you're deep underground, with rock above and below and nothing but darkness, you learn what matters. Not who's rich or poor, not who's been kind or cruel, just whether you're willing to help carry someone when they can't walk anymore." She looked at Tanner's ruined hands. "Can you walk, Jed?" He stared at her. Then slowly he began to cry. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry." "I know. Now help me ration the cornmeal. We've got 2 more days at least." Silas Crenshaw regained full consciousness on the 6th day. He woke to find himself wrapped in blankets in a corner of the chamber, surrounded by the people he had tried to dispossess, fed by the woman he had tried to destroy. For a long time he simply lay there, staring at the curved ceiling, the candles, the ventilation pipes that breathed clean air into this impossible sanctuary. When Lenora brought him water, he couldn't meet her eyes. "My office," he said. "My house. Did they—" "I don't know. We'll find out when the storm ends. I had papers in the office, deeds, contracts, 40 years of—" He stopped, seeming to hear himself for the first time. "It doesn't matter, does it?" "Not right now." He was quiet for a while. Then so softly she almost missed it. "You should have left me out there." Lenora sat down beside him, her back against the smooth clay wall. "My daughter was watching. What should I have taught her? That we only save people who've been kind to us? I tried to take everything from you. Yes, I would have succeeded if not for—" he gestured at the chamber around them, "if not for my father and my husband, and 1,000 generations of people who learned how to survive underground while men like you built empires on the surface." Crenshaw turned his head to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt with cold and shame. How did you know? How did you know it would work? I didn't know. I calculated. I measured. I trusted the numbers and the knowledge in the earth. She met his gaze steadily. The same way you trusted money and power, and the assumption that you understood this land better than anyone else. I built 47 structures in my career. Before I came here, I was an engineer in Philadelphia. A good one, I thought. And how many of them would have survived the storm? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The storm broke on the morning of the 7th day. Lenora knew it before she opened the hatch. The quality of silence changed. No longer the muffled roar of wind, but the absolute stillness that follows catastrophe. She climbed the ladder and pushed against the iron door, expecting resistance, finding the weight of drifted snow. It took an hour to dig their way out. When they finally emerged, blinking, into the impossible brightness of a clear winter morning, the world they found was unrecognizable. Where Broken Ridge had stood, there was now a landscape of snow and ruin. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of drifts. Walls had blown in. The church steeple, which had been the tallest structure in town, had snapped off and now lay half buried in white. Silas Crenshaw's office, that fine building with its imported glass and oak siding, was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Reduced to a pile of splintered timber scattered across a quarter acre. The survivors stood at the rim of the well, steam rising from the opening behind them, and surveyed the devastation. How many? Mercer asked, his voice barely audible. We won't know until we dig, Ashworth replied. They found 9 bodies in the next 3 days. 9 people who had stayed in their homes, trusting their walls and their stoves, and their certainty that this storm would be like all the others. 9 frozen statues, some still sitting in chairs, some collapsed near doors they had been trying to reach. The cold had taken them quickly, at least. That was the only mercy available. Among the dead were the Tanner parents, Jed's mother and father, found holding hands in their kitchen, their fire long since gone out. Jed stood over their bodies for a long time, saying nothing, his bandaged hands hanging at his sides. I should have been with them, he said finally. You would have died too, Lenora said. Maybe that would have been... No. Her voice was sharp enough to cut through his spiral. You're alive. That means something. That means you get to choose what happens next. He looked at her with eyes that had aged years and days. What happens next? You help us rebuild, different this time, better. Old Sven Lindqvist arrived at the claim on the 2nd day after the storm. His forge, built partially into a hillside in the old Swedish way, had held against the wind. He was the first from outside to reach Lenora's property, his white hair wild, his eyes bright with something like vindication. Jord Kellera, he said, looking at the survivors still emerging from the earth to begin another day of recovery work. I always knew the old ways would prove themselves. He became Lenora's first official assistant in the teaching that followed, the old blacksmith who remembered the old ways, helping translate them for a new world that was finally ready to listen. Deputy Virgil Holt arrived the next day. He came alone, without his badge, without his gun belt. He found Lenora organizing work parties to search for survivors and clear debris. I resigned, he said without preamble. This morning, gave my badge to the sheriff and walked out. Lenora paused in her work. Why? Because I was supposed to enforce the law. Instead, I enforced Crenshaw's greed. I knew what he was doing. The pressure, the deadlines, the way he pushed people off their land. And I did nothing. He looked at the well, at the ventilation pipes, at the evidence of everything he had doubted. I watched you build something that saved 17 lives, and I reported back to a man who wanted to take it from you. What will you do now? Learn, I guess, if you'll teach me. He met her eyes. I've got strong hands and no pride left. That seems like a good place to start. Everyone's welcome to learn, Deputy. That's the whole point. The reckoning came 2 weeks after the storm. Crenshaw had been staying in the Mercer store, which had survived with only partial damage. His office was rubble, his house was destroyed, and most of his papers had been scattered across the prairie by the wind. He was, for the first time in 40 years, a man with nothing but his name. He came to Lenora's claim on a gray January morning. She was working on the surface, building a small vestibule over the well opening, an airlock of sorts to prevent the temperature shock of direct entry. Maggie was helping, holding boards while her mother hammered. Copper watched them both with patient eyes. Crenshaw stopped at the edge of the claim. He didn't approach further. He just stood there, hat in his hands, waiting to be acknowledged. Lenora finished driving a nail before she turned to face him. Mr. Crenshaw, Mrs. Hartwell. Silence stretched between them. The wind blew, gentler now, carrying the smell of snow and wood smoke. I've been thinking, Crenshaw said finally, about what you said, in the chamber, about 47 structures. I remember. I was a good engineer once. I thought I was anyway. I learned from books and blueprints and men who learned the same way. He paused, struggling with words that clearly did not come easily. I never learned from the ground, never learned from the people who came before. I thought that was primitive, beneath me. Lenora waited. The storm killed 9 people. 9 people who trusted buildings I would have been proud of. Buildings that did exactly what they were designed to do. And it wasn't enough. He took a breath that shuddered in his chest. Your building, your hole in the ground, saved 17, including me. Including you. I came to ask, he stopped, started again. I came to ask if you would teach me. Teach us. The old ways. The ones that work. Lenora set down her hammer. She looked at Crenshaw, at the ruin of his pride written on his face. She thought about everything he had done. The threats, the sabotage, the smug certainty that she would fail. She thought about opening the hatch in the storm, about the choice she had made in that moment. Then slowly, Silas Crenshaw lowered himself to his knees in the snow. I was wrong, he said. We were all wrong, and you saved us anyway. Get up, Mr. Crenshaw. I called you a badger, a madwoman. I tried to take your land while you were building the only thing that could save us. I know. Get up. He rose, unsteady, brushing snow from his trousers. When he looked at her again, there were tears on his weathered cheeks. What can I do? To make it right? Lenora considered the question. You were an engineer. You can draft blueprints. You can calculate loads and angles. You can help other people understand what I'm doing in terms they're trained to recognize. You want me to document your methods? I want you to translate them. Turn the knowledge my father gave me into something that can be taught in schools and printed in books, so that when the next storm comes, and it will come, people won't have to rely on a widow with a hole in the ground. Crenshaw nodded slowly. I can do that. I will do that. Then we have an agreement. She picked up her hammer and turned back to her work. After a moment, Crenshaw walked away, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Maggie looked up from the board she was holding. Mama, are you still angry at him? Lenora drove a nail with a single precise stroke. I don't know, little bird, but I know that anger won't keep us warm, and neither will holding on to what people did before they knew better. So you forgave him? I gave him a chance to be different. Forgiveness is something he'll have to earn. I want you to stop one more time. Think about what just happened. The man who tried to destroy her is now kneeling in the snow, begging to help. And she says yes, not because she's forgotten what he did, but because she's thinking about the future, about the next storm, about the people who won't be born for another 100 years. That's something, isn't it? That's something worth remembering. Epilogue. The legacy. The spring of 1883 brought more than melting snow. It brought people, dozens of them at first, then hundreds, traveling from settlements across Kansas and Nebraska and Colorado to see the hole in the ground that had survived the Great Blizzard. They came in wagons and on horseback and sometimes on foot, carrying questions and skepticism and the particular hope of people who had watched their neighbors die and wanted to know how to prevent it from happening again. Lenora taught them all. She showed them how to read the earth, how to find the stable clay, avoid the sandy soil that would collapse, identify the places where water might seep. She showed them the mathematics of ventilation, the geometry of arched walls, the simple physics that turned a hole into a home. She didn't charge for the lessons, didn't ask for payment or credit or anything except attention. The knowledge isn't mine, she told everyone who asked. It belongs to the people who figured it out over thousands of years. I'm just passing it along. Old Sven worked beside her, demonstrating the metalwork needed for hatches and ventilation pipes. Silas Crenshaw produced technical drawings and instruction manuals, translating Lenora's methods into the language of formal engineering. Even Jedediah Tanner helped, his maimed hands proof of what the old ways had saved him from, his presence a living testament to second chances. Within 5 years, the ridge around Broken Ridge was dotted with ventilation pipes, those iron ears that had once been a joke and were now a symbol of survival. The town didn't look like a town anymore. It looked like a series of gentle mounds and metal hatches, a civilization that had learned to trade the vanity of the skyline for the security of the earth. Lenora married Daniel Moss, Reverend Ezekiel Moss's nephew, in the summer of 1885. Daniel was a carpenter who had come to Broken Ridge to help with the rebuilding and stayed when he fell in love with the widow who lived underground. He was quiet and steady and had hands that knew how to work without needing to be told twice. Maggie adored him. Copper tolerated him. That was enough. Their second child was born in 1886, a boy named Samuel, after Lenora's father. By then, the original chamber had been expanded into a network of connected rooms, each following the principles of the first: curved walls, proper drainage, passive ventilation. It was comfortable in a way that surface homes could never match. Cool in summer, warm in winter, quiet as a church. Maggie grew up knowing both worlds, the open sky and the embracing earth. She learned her letters by the light of candles underground and ran across the prairie with Copper at her heels. By the time she was 15, she could construct an earth shelter faster than most grown men, and by 20, she was teaching the techniques herself. "Mama always said the knowledge isn't ours," she would tell her students. "It belongs to everyone who comes after. We're just the ones who remember." Copper died in the fall of 1891. He was 14 years old, white-muzzled and slow, his joints too stiff for the ladder anymore. Lenora carried him up on his last day so he could feel the sun one more time. He lay in the grass, tail twitching weakly, watching the prairie with eyes that had seen everything that mattered. He died with his head in Maggie's lap and Lenora's hand on his side, surrounded by the people he had protected and the land he had helped them keep. They buried him at the edge of the original claim, near the well that had started everything. The marker was simple: Copper, the faithful one who never doubted 1877 to 1891. Maggie, 16 now, almost a woman, stood at the graveside and wept without shame. "He was Papa's dog," she said. "He was the last piece of Papa I had." Lenora held her daughter and let her cry. "He was a good dog, the best, and now he gets to rest. Do you think he'll see Papa? Wherever they go?" Lenora looked at the grave, at the marker, at the prairie stretching away in all directions. "I think wherever Copper is, your father found him within 5 minutes. And they're probably both wondering what's taking us so long." Maggie laughed through her tears. It was the first laugh in days. It sounded like hope. The Dust Bowl came in the 1930s. By then, Lenora was long gone. She had died peacefully in 1924 at the age of 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But her legacy lived on in the hundreds of earth-sheltered homes that dotted the Great Plains, in the techniques that had become standard practice, in the generations who knew how to survive because one woman had refused to accept the conventional wisdom. When the dust storms came, those black blizzards that stripped the topsoil and smothered everything in their path, the homes built by Lenora's methods remained habitable. Their ventilation systems filtered the air. Their sealed walls kept out the choking clouds. Their constant temperature provided refuge from the extremes that killed cattle and crops, and people who had built their lives on the assumption that the weather would be kind. Margaret Hartwell Dawson, Maggie's daughter, Lenora's granddaughter, was 62 when the worst of the Dust Bowl hit. She lived in the expanded network that had grown from the original well, now serving as home to 4 generations of the family. "Grandmother always said the earth would remember," she told a newspaper reporter who had come to document the survivors. "She said we just had to trust it, to go down instead of up, to become part of the land instead of fighting it." The reporter looked at the ventilation pipes, the hatches, the mounded earth that hid an entire community. "It's like nothing I've ever seen. It's like everything our ancestors saw," Margaret replied. "We just forgot for a while. Grandmother helped us remember." The archaeologists came in 2015. They were from the University of Kansas, studying historical examples of passive climate control. They had heard about the Hartwell chambers from engineering journals and historical society records. They wanted to see if the structures had survived, if the techniques still worked, if the stories were true. They found the original well shaft exactly where the records said it would be. Stone-lined, plumb, stable after more than a century. They descended with measuring equipment and cameras and the barely contained excitement of scientists encountering something remarkable. The chamber below was intact. The walls still gleamed with their lime wash, only slightly yellowed by time. The drainage channels still directed moisture away from the floor. The ventilation pipes still functioned, moving air through the space without fan or motor. The temperature was 50 degrees. It had been 50 degrees for 133 years. "This is extraordinary," the lead researcher said, her voice echoing slightly in the curved space. "The engineering is remarkable for its time. The understanding of thermal mass, passive ventilation, hydrology, it anticipates principles we're only now rediscovering." They found Lenora's name carved into one of the stones. They found Jacob's name beside it. They found other names too. Maggie, Daniel, Samuel, a chronicle of family written on the bones of the earth. And in one corner, barely visible in the lantern light, they found a small inscription. "The wind may own the sky. The wise own the ground beneath it." In 2019, the original Hartwell chamber was designated a National Historic Landmark. The bronze plaque mounted at the site reads, "Lenora Hartwell, 1848 to 1924, pioneer of underground architecture who proved that ancestral wisdom and modern survival are the same thing," below, that in smaller letters, "I didn't build a house, I reclaimed a constant." Visitors come every year now, school children on field trips, engineering students researching passive solar design, elderly tourists who remember stories their grandparents told about the woman who lived underground. They descend the original ladder, reinforced now with safety rails and lighting, and stand in the chamber where 17 people survived the storm that killed 9. They feel the constant temperature. They breathe the clean air. They try to imagine what it was like to be called crazy for doing the one thing that could save your life. Most of them can't imagine it. That's the strange thing about being right too early. Once everyone accepts your truth, they forget you ever had to fight for it. But the earth remembers. The earth always remembers. And that's the story of Lenora Hartwell, the Badger widow who turned a dry well into a sanctuary, who saved her enemies along with her friends, who proved that sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Is there knowledge in your family, wisdom passed down from parents or grandparents, that the modern world dismisses? Things that people call old-fashioned or primitive or unnecessary? Maybe, just maybe, that knowledge is waiting for its moment, waiting for the storm that will show everyone what you've known all along. Lenora Hartwell trusted the earth, and the earth kept her promise. What will you trust? The end.